Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Behind the Sermon, a time when two pastors sit down and talk about all things preaching and practical ministry. My name is Todd Lovell, joined at the table, as always, by Pastor Andrew Thompson. Andrew, how's it going?
I'm doing very well today, Todd. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for asking. Also joined in our First Church studio by our producer extraordinaire, Nathan Lindsay, or as we like to call him, the man who does not speak. Nathan, how are you? Fantastic. Moving right along in our discipleship worship series this week with our concluding sermon, Leap into Eternal Love. So come along with us as we go behind the sermon. Book it. Print. So Andrew, I noticed something this past week that I noticed sometimes, but I thought it might be helpful for us to talk about. We preach, anytime somebody at First Church preaches, they preach 3 services.
Yes.
On Sunday mornings.
Right.
And so an interesting thing happened this past Sunday, which has happened in different degrees, I think, in some of your sermons that you've preached. But your sermon that you preached at 8:30 kind of changed at 9:45 and then kind of changed again at 11. And so you were I think we had a brief conversation about this after the service, that there were certain things that you were trying to tailor to that audience, and also you were kind of on the fly adjusting depending on how people were responding, those sorts of things.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about what's going on, because I don't think people in the pews for one service aren't going to notice that, but for people that sort of see, like myself, who see all 3 services every week, that I started to pick up on that. And so it's an interesting process, I think, as a preacher, that throughout the day, both as you sort of tune your sermon, but also as you gear it towards who is in the room, the material kind of changes a little bit. Maybe talk a little bit of how that works for you.
This is one of those kind of pulling the curtain back and seeing the inner workings of this. So maybe this will be of interest to people that are unfamiliar with the preaching process. There is a rhetoric to preaching. Preaching is public speech. And so much like a politician who speaks, or much like a news broadcaster, or a teacher, a preacher is someone who is involved in the practice of public speech. And public speech, of course, is speech that is inherently intended to be persuasive.
Right.
You don't stand up and speak unless you are trying to communicate something that you hope is going to resonate and find purchase with your audience, which in the case of a worship service is a congregation of people who are there to worship God. And so there's the sermon that you walk in with on Sunday morning, okay, which is literally, for me, that's usually a full manuscript. 99 times out of 100, it'll be a full manuscript. And then there is the sermon that actually gets preached. And there's a process that happens between taking it from text to speech. That's really an organic and a living process. Part of it is the personality of the preacher himself. It could be what you had for breakfast that morning.
Yeah.
It can be what was in your prayer life that morning. It can be, maybe something that you read in your morning devotional that has affected. So there's going to be some things that happen in terms of transition. There's obviously, we believe that the Holy Spirit is active there.
Right.
And I think that when preachers are at their best, what they're asking in their inward heart is that the words that they speak would be moved or would be motivated by God speaking through them.
Right.
Okay. But then there's also the congregation itself, and when you're standing up and you're looking into the faces of people, if you are someone who's not just reading from a text, if you're standing up, it feels like, I don't know how to describe it, and I hope that the people in this church that hear this podcast or that watch the video version of the podcast will take this in the best way possible. But it feels like you're speaking to a living organism.
Yeah.
There's almost a pulse to it.
Absolutely. I actually I have a really strong interest in rhetoric, and I'm not great at public speaking, but I have a strong interest in people who are. And one of the things through a lot of my readings about rhetoric is I've discovered that how much stand-up comedians have to teach pastors about timing and content and how they shape the material. Yeah. Jerry Seinfeld, who's one of my favorite comedians, has this great quote where he says, being a stand-up comedian is the toughest job in the world because every 8 seconds you're judged.
Yes, yeah.
And I want to come back at Jerry and say, except for pastors.
Right.
Because pastors also, every 8 seconds, you're being judged, right? And there's something about having that material and having that manuscript, but you are preaching to this living, breathing thing that, a point that works at 8:30 may not work at 11.
Yeah.
Or may not even be applicable or relevant. You know what I mean? And so there's this organic nature that every 8 seconds you're checking yourself and saying, do I need to go here or do I need to go here?
Yeah.
Right? Do I need to say this? Maybe I need to say it, but do I need to say it this way or do I need to say it that way?
Right.
Because it really is. I think maybe people in the pews don't realize how much of a conversation it actually is.
Yeah.
Because you are the only person in the room talking.
Right.
But it's still a conversation.
It is.
You know what I mean?
It is. And you're reading the reactions of on
doing your
people's
best
faces.
Yeah.
And there's something that is communicated that I don't know how to describe this except that people that have done this know what I'm talking about. But when you're standing up there, it's part of it's the looks on people's faces and the reactions that you get, but there's an energy that is very difficult to quantify, and you feel that energy. And when when the message is being preached well, and when it's really resonating with people, it's like that energy kind of crackles up,
well,
and you can feel it.
Nathan, our producer, the man who does not speak, he's not speaking, but he is nodding his head, and I think that's because he's a musician, and,
right?
And it's probably the same sort of thing with musicians,
and
right?
you know this feeling, right?
Yeah,
know it when you're up there on the stage and you're playing a set, and you're really killing it, and the audience is really into it. I mean, there's just something that's difficult to quantify, but it's there. It's obviously there.
Right.
In the same way that if you want to blow it up to maybe not a musician who's playing at a in front of an audience of a couple of hundred, or a preacher who's preaching in front of an audience of a couple of hundred, but let's say you go to a college football game this Saturday and you're there with 75,000 people.
Sure.
I mean, if you really want to see it in a way that's unmistakable, look at, and it's the reason why after professional athletes retire, you'll see interviews of them later, and they always wax nostalgic about what it was like to be on the field, because the adulation of the crowd is just something that you can't, for an athlete, it's just something that just can't be beat.
Yeah.
Well, what is that? Well, it's a similar type of energy in the sense that there's an interplay between what's going on in the part of the people who are there being watched by everybody else, and then what's going on the part of the watchers.
I mean, you'll even hear like football players saying like, on that fourth down, we just really felt the energy of the crowd behind us, and that gave us the jolt we needed.
Right.
Well, there's no energy being like exchanged there, like scientifically, but there is. In a very, if you're in it, especially if you're in that situation, you feel it. I mean, it's palpable. Like, you can experience that. So
I have gotten really interested in this myself, because when the divinity school that I went to, the seminary program that I was in, the approach to preaching paid almost no attention to rhetoric. So it was all about the theology of the sermon. And I know that not all seminaries are like this, because I've spoken to people that went to seminaries where preaching as public speech was taken more seriously in the coursework. In other words, how you talk about the rhetoric, what preaching enacted looks like. But in the program that I went to, the idea of preaching enacted was simply not part of the program. So it was all about the theology of the sermon. And so when in the preaching classes that we took, when you had to write sermons, we literally just sat down around a seminar table and read them to people. And I know that at other seminaries they have preaching labs where you stand up behind a pulpit and you're actually preaching, and then you're getting critiqued by both the professor and your fellow students. I just didn't get that
Which is not nerve-wracking at all.
Yeah, no, that's not. No, not at all. Not at all.
Which is unfortunate because, and these numbers kind of fluctuate depending on what source you're looking at, but they say like roughly 10% of communication is actually the content of what you're saying.
Yeah.
And the other 90% is like how you're saying it, the way you look when you're saying it, the inflections that you use, those types of things.
Sure.
So to neglect that's really unfortunate.
Yeah. And for me, it's made me just that much more interested in it myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a practitioner. And I've talked to you about this before, that what I was like as a preacher before I became a professor in a seminary and spent several years teaching was very different than what kind of preacher I am now. So I have a tendency, anyone who's seen me preach knows this, I cannot stay behind the pulpit. I roam.
Right.
And I'll go over to one side of the chancel and I'll speak to the people here, and then I'll go to the other side of the chancel and I'll speak to the people here. And not some of that is calculated, not all of it is calculated.
Were you the same way in the classroom?
In the classroom, that's where I developed that.
Okay.
So as a preacher, before I went back to graduate school and taught for several years, I was more of a behind the pulpit kind of a preacher.
Sure.
Well, when you lecture to a group of students, you're going up and you're writing things on the board,
Sure, yeah.
or maybe you're using a PowerPoint and you're getting out of the way so that you can show the PowerPoint screen. And professors tend to do that. They tend to roam around their classrooms.
Right.
It's just nobody tells you to do it. You just end up doing it.
Right.
And that dramatically affected the way that I approach preaching. So I approach preaching in the way that I do because I had this experience as a classroom professor.
Well, stuff like that. I mean, we could sit here. That could be a whole other podcast. Us sitting here talking about more of the preacher craft or sermon craft sort of stuff. But hopefully that's informative for people that are either watching or listening, and maybe pay a little closer attention to that when you're in the pew next week, and when you see us preaching, and how a lot of that is. Some of it's instinctual, but a lot of it is thought out. We do think about where we'll be standing when we say certain things, or how we'll be standing, or how we'll say those things, and it's really interesting to see. Let's talk a little bit more concretely about this upcoming sermon. We're rounding out our discipleship sermon series, and so we have this sermon, "Leap into Eternal Love." And so, talk a little bit about how we're gonna stick the landing on this thing.
Yeah, so this is the final sermon in an 8-part sermon series. I'll say first something about an 8-part sermon series. I've never done an 8-part sermon series before. I've done 4-part sermon series. I've done 6-part sermon series. An 8-part sermon series is
it's a long time.
It's a long time, and I know that I have listened to the podcasts of pastors who will take literally an entire year of Sundays to preach through, let's say, the book of Acts or something like that. And I don't know how they do it, because you just get so caught up in the particular theme that you're working on, and it's like running a distance race. I mean, you get to the point where, like, here we are in week 8, and I have loved this series. I've had a great time with it. It has caused me to think about discipleship in some different sorts of ways. And now here we are at the end. And while I'm really, really excited about preaching this final sermon, because I think it's going to be different than what people would expect, it feels like it's time to bring this thing to a close.
Okay.
It really does. The way that I'm going to try to bring it to a close is to talk about discipleship in the word here. Here's the $7 word. Okay, in an eschatological way. Okay, eschatological refers to the eschaton, and eschaton is a word that comes from the Greek that refers to the end of days, or the end times, or things being brought to a culmination or a fulfillment.
Literally the last things.
Literally the last things. That's right. So what is the eschaton in the Bible? Well, in the Bible, the eschaton is, the best way to think about it, or the easiest way to think about it, is what we see in the book of Revelation, where we see the return of Christ and all things being brought to a fulfillment that eventuates in Revelation chapters 21 and 22, which is the new heavens and the new earth.
Yeah.
The heavenly city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of the clouds from heaven as a bride adorned for her husband. And this is the image of Jesus' triumphant return and coming. It says, and the home of God shall be amongst men. He shall be their God, and they shall be his people, and he will wipe every tear from their eyes. So we have this sense in the Christian faith that things are heading towards a fulfillment.
Yes.
It's not just that each of our individual deaths is the end for us, but that time and that history are moving towards the completion of all the purposes that God has for the creation that He's made.
I think that's really interesting point, and it's subtle, but I think it's very important that Revelation is not about. You have hints of this in some of Paul's epistles, but really the point of Revelation is just that things are heading towards not their destruction, but they're restoration.
That's right.
Right? They're heading, just what you said, they're heading towards the fulfillment of the purposes that God initially set out, right?
Right.
And so I think oftentimes when we talk about the end times or the last things or the book of Revelation, it can become this very doomsday thing, right? Like everything is spiraling towards destruction. Well, it's not really the point of Revelation, right?
No, it's not.
I mean, things might get worse before they get better. I mean, that might be a theme that you could argue for. But the point is that in the end, things will be back to where they're supposed to be.
Right.
Things will be restored, right? Behold, I am making all things new, right? Not behold, I'm throwing everything in the trash can. That's not, or behold, I'm making all new things. That's not what it is. He's making all things new. And so there's a restorative aspect of that I think is important and shouldn't be overlooked.
Yes, yes. So there's and here's how I want to kind of link that up with the idea of discipleship. So
Okay.
in terms of discipleship, the themes, the notes that I've been hitting have had to do with what it means for you, Todd Lovell, as a follower of Jesus, to live the life of discipleship in a robust and a full-bodied way, kind of play off of that kind of coffee imagery, and that's something that involves all of your senses and all of your life, okay? But then the question becomes, I think the natural question for all human beings becomes, to what end? Okay, to what end?
Sure.
Is it to riff off of the title of a Spike Lee movie from the 1990s? Is it just about what it means to do the right thing?
I thought you were going to say white men can't jump.
Is it about that either? Okay.
Was that a Spike Lee movie? We'll figure it out later. We'll fix it in post, whatever that means. Yeah.
Is it about what it means to do the right thing, or is there something more?
Yeah,
and
sure.
And what I'm convinced from my reading of the scriptures is that it's really about something more, and the something more is where each one of our individual lives of discipleship links into what God's larger purposes are in the world.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the scripture passage that I'm going to use comes from the 23rd chapter of the Gospel of Luke. And this is not a passage that we tend to think about in relation to discipleship, but it's one that I'm going to use, and I'll explain why. Let me read it. It's fairly short. It's verses 39 to 43. And this is in the middle of the crucifixion. Okay?
Right.
So Jesus is literally hanging there on the cross, and he's been crucified between two other men who are described as bandits or thieves, and they've also been crucified. And it says, starting in verse 39, one of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him, saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." So you have this tremendous image of the idea that it's never too late for forgiveness, and it's never too late to be brought into communion with Jesus, and that what it means for this criminal, for this thief who's just hours or perhaps just minutes from death, what it means is that the end of his life is not the end of him. That he is going to be united with Jesus forever in paradise. Now, what you could talk a little bit about what paradise means, because what paradise means in that sense, or what heaven means in that sense, is probably what we would call an intermediate state between the death of this man and the restoration of all things at the end of days.
Sure.
But the larger point is that his leap from this life is not a leap into the abyss. It's not a leap into the void.
Right.
It's not a leap into annihilation. It's a leap into paradise.
Yeah.
It's a leap into God's eternal love.
Yeah. There's a really, not to go down a rabbit hole, but there's a really interesting grammatical argument there. So your original Greek text, first of all, is in all capital letters and is no spaces because you're wanting to save parchment, right? Parchment, or what they wrote on papyrus paper, was at a premium. So anytime you got a piece, you wanted to fill that whole thing with text. You didn't want any spaces. And so, but also there's no punctuation, right? So there's a bit of an argument about, is Jesus saying, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise," or is he saying, "Truly I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise"?
Yeah.
Right? Like, which is an interesting thing where we always hear that a certain way, and yet there's like this grammatical thing when you actually look. It's like, what is Jesus actually saying? at the end, it doesn't necessarily matter because the end is you will be with me in paradise.
Right.
Right.
But what is the end?
What is the end, and when does that happen? In some ways, that doesn't really matter to us, right? Even if we knew one way or the other, we have no control over that anyway. And so, but it's just an interesting little side note there.
It does speak to the distinction between what it means for a spirit to be united or a soul to be united with God in heaven prior to the general resurrection, and what it means for us to be brought into the kingdom after the general resurrection.
Right.
And that's something you and I have talked about this before, perhaps even on this podcast, that there is a distinction there between heaven and the new creation. And that's not something that a lot of believers really understand very well, I think.
N.T. Wright has a great saying about that. He says, a lot of times Christians are focused on life after death, but what they really should be focused on is life after death.
Yeah.
Right? Like not just this time when you're in the bosom of Abraham, so to speak, but that time of the general resurrection when all things are fully restored to God's purpose. Yeah. How do we... So I know this text has been abused throughout the centuries, this idea of sort of deathbed conversions. Right? They're like, well, if the thief at the 11th hour, quite literally, the 11th hour can repent and enter into paradise with Christ, why should we be concerned about conversion until we're on, the brink of death ourselves? What does that have to say about how we're actually living in the midst of life, not just on the brink of death?
Well, I think the way to answer that is actually you can answer it with reference to what those guys like St. Anthony and St. Paul were doing in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries in the Egyptian desert when they were fleeing what they saw as the decay of the cities and going out into the desert to live as hermits and monks. This was actually the origin of monasticism in the middle of the Roman Empire. Excuse me. And what they were wanting to do is that they were wanting to live in anticipation of resurrected life. And so what does it mean to do that? Well, what it means to do is to put thirsting and striving after political power behind you. It means for them, it meant putting sex and marriage behind you. It means putting the acquisitiveness of wanting to accumulate wealth and land ownership behind you. It means putting the gluttonous desires for constant food and drink behind you. The reason being that when we are in the resurrection, we will be, as Jesus says in the Gospels, we will be as the angels are in heaven. And so what they're doing is the monks are going out and living in anticipation of that time, and they're engaging in a kind of a spiritual warfare with the devil and his demons, because what does the devil do? Well, the devil is telling you, go back and get married, go back and get a job and build up wealth, go back and acquire power, go back and go to parties in the city where there will be abundant food and drink. And so the monks really believe they're engaging in a kind of a spiritual warfare. What I would say is, I'm not sure that they always had everything right about the way that they thought about that, but what they did have right is the idea that their discipleship to Jesus is something that is actually leading somewhere, and that the discipleship of Jesus in the present is like an anticipation. It's like an anticipatory echo of the life of full discipleship that will come in the kingdom when we are with him forever. And so what we're doing is that we are like athletes training for a competition.
Sure.
You played football in high school. I played football in high school. The longest month of the year was the month of August for two-a-days, right? Yeah. So you go out there.
The hottest month of the year, too.
Yes, it was.
At least in Arkansas, yeah.
You'd go out there and you'd practice from about 8:30 to about 11 in the morning, and then you'd go and you'd eat lunch and you'd take a nap and you'd go back at about 3 in the afternoon and you'd practice again. Well, what is the reason that you're doing that? You're actually playing football. You're putting on pads.
Sure.
You're hitting. You're running. You're doing drills. You're eventually running plays. But even though you're playing football on the practice field, you're not doing it just so at the end of August you can say, "Well, that was good to get in shape. Let's hang up the pads."
That was fun. Yeah.
You're doing it because there's a season that's coming. You're doing it because you're getting ready to play on Friday nights. And in a sense, what the life of discipleship in this life is doing is that it's preparing us, it's training us for what it will mean to live with Jesus eternally. And that's why a guy like John Wesley will say that the life of holiness, the life of discipleship or the life of holiness is really the only true happiness that we know in this life. And that when you come to a place where you're experiencing holiness, it makes you happy.
Yeah.
And you might be surprised that it makes you happy because you didn't think at the beginning it would, but it does. And the reason it makes you happy is because all along, that's what God has been preparing you for. So what the leap into eternal love is, I mean, in a certain sense, the story of the thief is beautiful, the thief on the cross.
Sure.
In another sense, the story of the thief is tragic because while he's going to leap into paradise with Jesus, he missed out on an awful lot that could have been wonderful and life-giving. He got very fortunate that he ended up next to the Son of God on the cross.
Sure.
But he missed out on an entire life of serving God prior to that. Well, as you and I sit here, we don't have to miss out on that life.
Right.
The people that are listening to this podcast, the people that will be in worship on Sunday, they don't have to miss out on that life. We can live that life of discipleship so that when we come to the end and we get ready to leap, we're leaping into something that we've already had an inkling of in the life that we've lived to that point.
And I imagine that gives us assurance in the face of death and in face of difficult times.
Indeed.
That we've tasted the goodness of God already. So
yes.
That's a good word. I look forward to this Sunday. Thank you, Pastor Andrew. That was great. Thank you, Nathan Lindsay. For myself, Todd Lovell, and all of us here at First Church, thank you for watching or listening. And we hope to see you again next time on Behind the Sermon.